people who have to deal with some shit afterwards, that's not a disorder. That's just the natural process that's going on.
You gotta process it. You can't process it right there at the moment because you gotta focus, like we're talking about. But eventually, your brain it ain't went away. You can't unsee or unhear things, so you're gonna eventually get back to it one way or another.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the stuff that builds up and gets so heavy is because you don't realize that it's happening at the time. Like I was talking about earlier about wishing I could have recognized some of those signs and symptoms, but just the short-term memory loss that starts taking place and the frustration that creates. I didn't realize any of that was happening. I didn't realize it was happening until I was coming out of the storm,
Right.
And then I'm still dealing with it. And you just, I mean, I don't know where it's going to go as more time goes on, but I've legitimately just kind of learned to live with it. I take as many notes as I need to take, and
phones, notepads, yes, like, that helps. It does help.
100%.
Yeah,
it gives some of that control back, and that's the most frustrating part about this whole thing. Is I lived my life in a world that revolved around control. Right? I arrive on scene, I got to take control of that scene immediately. So everything else in my life had to fit into that box. And that's as ridiculous as everything else when I look back at it in retrospect. But, when you start losing basic functions, like I remember my vision starting to go, when the tinnitus started to set in and become more and more frequent, the short-term stuff, the irritability, the not being able to sleep, like when all that shit starts to add up. And we would laugh about it, me amongst the other guys. We almost like pissing contests of how much sleep did you get tonight? Oh, you got 2 hours? Well, I got 3 hours, so blow me. But you don't realize at the time that shit's really starting to stack up.
Nor is it normal.
It's not normal. Yeah, exactly. But what's normal when you're living that lifestyle? Like
there is no normal, really.
Right. There's no normal in any of it. But that's where the stigma aspect we have to start addressing. If we're ever going to get ahead of this issue, and start allowing agencies and military branches to start retaining a lot of guys that they're losing from this affliction, it's going to take getting ahead of it, getting guys to recognize this is not if you are going to get it, it's when it's going to come out. And it could happen several years after you get out of whatever line you're in, but it's going to come out. Right. The first dead guy I was ever on, and dead guys are coming up, but dead guys were never what bothered me. But again, another sign that I can remember, one of my closest buddies who'd been on the search and rescue team I was on for decades called me the next day and said, "Hey, I just wanted to check in on you, make sure you're doing okay." And I said, "Yeah, I didn't really think much of it after we got done." And he said, "Well, you never know how people are going to process it. Sometimes you don't think anything of it for the longest time, and then you roll over 5 years later and look at your wife, and she's got the face of the dead guy." And I remember at the time thinking, so I got that to look forward to. And I legitimately did 8 years, 9 years down the road, but that's what you have coming. I mean, it's not a matter of, are you going to be burdened by some level of this affliction? It's when and how severe, and what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do to recognize that it's coming on instead of having to cope with it? Because if you recognize it, and it's like getting back to the mechanics, understanding the mechanics of it. If I had understood the mechanics and was able to kind of compartmentalize what's going on in my head, what are the repercussions, what am I doing to cope that's unhealthy that I can get ahead of? How do I deal with these sleeping issues? I think I could still be in the fight, and none of us want to be out of the fight.
Yeah, that's one of the things that, when you mentioned earlier about not being aware of how. So like when you first start, this is where I'm going with it. So when you first start going to treatment or what have you, you sit down with the counselor or whoever. One of the first things they ask you is like such an easy question you should be able to answer, but you don't. At least for me, I wasn't in a place to even understand that question. Like something like, "Well, what are you feeling?"
Yeah.
What do you mean what I'm feeling? You know what I mean? You almost get like offended.